name is Arthur Callahan, but in the cold echo of these stone corridors, I am merely number 4B82. I am 78 years old, and if you look closely at the deep wrinkles on my face, you will see 56 years of concrete and iron bars etched into my skin. I am sitting on the edge of a mattress as thin as a wafer, listening to the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights that never truly go out. The air in this cell smells of industrial bleach and the stagnant breath of men who gave up a long time ago. Outside that small barred window, the moon is just a silver sliver cutting through the darkness. But in here, time does not move. It simply rots away. I have spent more than half a century waiting for a moment that has finally arrived. Yet I have never felt so terrified in my life. In my trembling hand, I hold a piece of paper that most men in this place would kill to touch. It is my parole notification, a formal letter stating that the gates can finally open for me after 5 decades of silence. You might think I would be dancing or crying with joy, but instead, I am staring at the heavy steel door of my cell with a heart full of lead. I have forgotten how to be a person out there. I have become a ghost haunting my own life, a creature of habit and iron locks. Before the sun rises and the guards tell me I am free, I need to tell you how I got here, and why the light of the outside world feels like a death sentence. Listen carefully, because my story is the map of a road you will never want to travel. Back in 1968, I was 22 years old and felt like I could carry the entire city on my back. I worked on the docks as a stevedore, unloading massive trucks under a sun that smelled of salt, diesel smoke, and accumulated sweat. My hands were always calloused, covered in a mixture of grease and dust from the industrial warehouses of our working-class neighborhood. It was a loud, chaotic world, full of iron and physical exertion, where a man's worth was measured by the weight he could lift without complaining. I loved the rhythmic clatter of the heavy machinery and the rough talk of the men I called brothers. Back then, my life was simple and solid, built on the absolute certainty that if I worked hard enough, the world would eventually surrender to my will and my strong, young arms. Friday nights were the sacred reward for those long and exhausting shifts at the harbor docks. I would go straight to the corner bar, a smoky place filled with the smell of cheap beer, sawdust on the floor, and strong tobacco. That was where I felt most alive, surrounded by faces I had known since childhood, and the woman who held my entire future in her hands. Sarah was always there, glowing with a 3-month pregnancy that made her the only truly beautiful thing in that gray industrial landscape. We would sit in our usual booth, planning a life that seemed small, but to us, it was absolutely perfect. I was the king of that little piece of the world, a man with a steady job and a family on the way, completely oblivious to the dark shadow that was already lurking near our reality. I had an inflammable pride back then, a short fuse that I foolishly confused with masculinity and strength of character. On those streets, you didn't back down from anyone. You stood your ground and let your fists do the talking if anyone dared to cross the line of disrespect. I firmly believed I was invincible, convinced that no problem was too big for my physical strength to solve in an instant. Looking back now from inside this cramped cell, I see only a young man who was blinded by his own arrogance and the addictive rush of adrenaline. I felt entitled to demand respect as if it were oxygen, never stopping to think about the thin line between being a man and becoming a monster. The air was thick with the smell of fried food that night, a night that seemed just like any other before the fall. The music on the jukebox was loud, drowning out the laughter of the stevedores and the clinking of glasses when that stranger appeared out of nowhere. He smelled of cheap bourbon and a bitterness I should have ignored, but he stumbled and bumped heavily into Sarah's shoulder. I saw the shock in her eyes as he let out a filthy comment, a phrase loaded with venom about her condition and what he would do if we were alone. In that instant, the world around me simply vanished, leaving only the sound of my own blood pounding in my temples like a war drum. The pride I carried like armor transformed into an uncontrollable fire inside my chest, clouding any shred of reason I still possessed. I didn't see a pathetic drunk man. I saw a target that needed to be destroyed to restore my dominance. My right hand closed around the green glass ashtray, a heavy, solid object resting on the stained wooden counter. I didn't think about the consequences or the future I was carrying in Sarah's womb. I simply acted with the brute force of a wounded animal. The blow was swift and accurate, striking the side of the man's head with a violence that scares me to this day. The sound of the bone cracking was sharp, cutting through the music like a dry thunderclap that suddenly echoed throughout the bar. I watched his body collapse without any resistance, hitting the floor with a dull thud as stale beer spread in a dark puddle. The metallic smell of blood began to rise, mixing with the acrid scent of cigarettes, while I stared at my trembling hands, stained by something I could never wash away. The red and blue lights of the police cars began to swirl against the foggy windows of the bar, painting the walls with the color of warning and tragedy. I was still standing there, mesmerized by the motionless man on the floor, when I felt the strong arms of the officers slamming me against the rough counter. The biting cold of the steel handcuffs tightened around my wrists with a definitive finality, a grip I would never stop feeling in my soul. I looked at Sarah one last time and saw only a broken reflection of terror and disappointment on her pale, tear-stained face. As they dragged me out, the night air, which once seemed full of promise, now suffocated me with the weight of a choice that would last an eternity. I was a man who, in 10 seconds of blind rage, had thrown decades of life directly into the trash. The hangover that night wasn't caused by the alcohol I drank, but by a brutal reality that crushed my lungs as soon as the sun rose. The deafening metallic clang of the holding cell door closing behind me was a thunderclap that never stopped echoing in my ears. I vividly remember the smell of cheap disinfectant and old urine that permeated the peeling walls, a violent contrast to the sea breeze of the docks. I shook uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from a visceral dread I never knew existed inside a man. My hands, which used to carry heavy burdens with ease, could now barely hold the metal mug of lukewarm water. I was a stranger to myself, a strong young man reduced to a cornered animal in a cubicle of cement and shadows. On the day of the trial, the courtroom felt like a shadow theater where I was the only spectator of my own imminent ruin. I saw Sarah's pale face in the front row, her eyes red from crying, and her small hands stroking the belly where our son grew, oblivious to everything. That was the moment the realization finally hit me with the weight of a mountain on my tired chest. When the judge struck the gavel and pronounced the 60-year sentence, I felt as if the floor beneath my feet had simply vanished into the void. The air fled my lungs, and the world became a blur of muffled voices and dark uniforms. I wanted to scream, to ask for forgiveness, to beg for a second chance, but my voice was dead in my throat as reality swallowed me alive. The transition to the state prison was the final blow that erased any trace of the Arthur people knew on the docks. My civilian clothes, which still carried the scent of Sarah's perfume and bar smoke, were stripped away and replaced by rough, impersonal rags. My name, which my mother had chosen with such care, was erased and replaced by a cold sequence of numbers etched onto an identification card. I understood, in the absolute darkness of that first night in B-Wing, that the life I knew had been switched off like a lamp in an empty room. The silence of the cell was cut only by distant screams and the rhythmic thumping of the guards' boots on the cold concrete outside. I was now just a number, waiting for time to pass, while the world outside continued to spin without me. Sarah's letters started as a lifeline, arriving every Tuesday, smelling of soap and promises of eternal waiting. In the beginning, I read every word until I memorized the strokes of her handwriting, imagining the face of my son I never got to hold. But the years are machines that grind hope, and the world outside stops for no one, least of all for a man locked in a concrete box. By the 4th year, the letters began to come monthly. By the 10th, they became dry Christmas cards, and then absolute silence settled in like a heavy mist. I understood that she needed to bury the dead man I had become, so that my son could have a life with a father who actually existed in the real world. Loneliness ceased to be a visitor and became the only permanent resident of this cold, dark cell. Time in here isn't measured by clocks, but by the number of layers of gray paint the guards slap on the bars to hide the rust. I used to look at myself in that scratched metal mirror and see a young man with a strong jaw and eyes full of fire. But that image was slowly erased by decades of artificial light. Wrinkles began to dig deep furrows into my skin, as if the prison itself were trying to sculpt me in its own image. My hair, which was once black as the coal on the docks, became white, brittle strands that fall silently onto the cement floor. Every time I face myself in that dull surface, I feel like I'm looking at a stranger, a living fossil the system preserved only to demonstrate how much life can be wasted between 4 narrow walls. The news of my mother's death came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a guard who didn't even look me in the eye. He just slid a sterile piece of paper through the bars, a cold telegram informing me that the only heart that still beat for me in the world had stopped. I couldn't go to the funeral. I couldn't hold her hand or ask for forgiveness for being the son who brought her so much shame. I cried in absolute silence, burying my face in the filthy pillow so no one would see my weakness. For the first rule here is never to show where it hurts. Grief inside a cell is a wound that never closes, a pain that circulates in circles while you count the steps from one wall to the other. Her world ended, and mine remained suspended in the void. Gradually, the rigid, crushing routine began to seep into my bones, turning me into a part of a cold and impersonal machine. The sound of military boots marching down the gallery at 6 in the morning became my only alarm clock, and the head count my moment of social recognition. I forgot the taste of fruit picked from a tree, or the feeling of the wind hitting my face without passing through a chain-link screen. The open space, which was once my domain on the docks, began to cause me a strange nausea and a desperate desire to return to the safety of my four walls. The system didn't just lock me up, it domesticated me, molding my desires until prison became the only reality my brain could process. I became a clock that only ticks hours inside a dungeon. Now, at 78 years old, the notice that my parole hearing was finally approved didn't bring the relief I had been expecting for 5 decades. Instead of joy, I felt a paralyzing panic attack that took my breath away in the middle of the night, while cold sweat ran down my tired back. The idea of walking through that massive gate and facing a world that evolved without me is more terrifying than any fight I've witnessed in this yard. I've heard that people now carry the world in pocket devices, and that the streets are full of noises I can't identify. The fear of being free is a silent disease that afflicts those forgotten by time. I am a bird that has completely forgotten how to flap its wings. Cell 4B has become the only home my heart can still recognize. I look at my hands now and I no longer see the brute strength of the docks. I see only the instrument of a ruin I built myself with the bricks of my pride. For a long time, I tried to blame the system, cruel fate, or even that man who fell on the dirty bar floor. But the truth is a knife that only cuts deep when you are alone in absolute darkness. The mistake wasn't just the blow with the ashtray. It was the stupid belief that my honor was worth more than a fellow human's life and the future of my own family. This inflammable pride, which I displayed like a medal, was the heaviest chain I've ever carried in these 56 years. Today, only a vast emptiness remains, and the awareness that the man I was died that night. The battle I fight now is not against the guards or against these iron bars, but against the mirror that shows me a man who is terrified of the open horizon. I feel a corrosive guilt for having destroyed so many lives. But what truly keeps me from sleeping in this cold cell is the perception that I've become a coward, institutionalized by time. I should want to run outside, feel the grass and see the sea. But my heart begs for the sound of the gate locking at 10 at night. The pattern of obedience and silence the system imposed on me has become my only skin, and the idea of making basic decisions, like what to eat or where to walk, causes me unbearable dizziness. I am a prisoner of my mind, an old man who learned to love the chains because he forgot the weight of freedom. Earlier today, during the yard time, I walked up to the double wire fence and stood watching the highway in the distance. I saw cars passing at a speed my tired mind could barely process. Shiny machines that look like spaceships crossing a horizon that no longer belongs to me. I remembered the old magazines in the library that talked about phones that are computers, and a world where money doesn't even exist on paper. I looked at my age-stained hands and felt a crushing weight in my chest, a sudden and painful understanding that I am a fossil walking among shadows. The silence of the yard hit me like a punch, and I realized that out there I would just be a useless baby trapped in a decaying body, a stranger in a land that forgot my language and my name. I went back to my cell and sat on the bed, feeling the familiar comfort of the thin mattress and the smell of disinfectant that is now my perfume. In here, between these peeling concrete walls, I am still old Artie, the man who knows the rules, who has his meal at the right time, and who understands the sound of every key. The realization hit me with a cruel and absolute clarity. The worst revenge time took on me wasn't stealing my youth or keeping me from my son. The system's true crime was molding me so deeply that I grew to love my own cage and fear the open sky. I understood, with an acute pain, that the freedom I begged for so much is now my greatest threat. For prison has become the only place where I still know how to breathe. The lesson that the hardness of this concrete floor taught me, too late to be useful, is that pride is the heaviest chain a man can carry. We spend our lives believing we need to prove our strength, that every slight requires a response in kind, and that our honor is a crystal that shatters with a simple bump. But the naked truth, whispered by the ghosts of these galleries, is that 10 seconds of blind rage can cost 50 years of absolute silence. There is no victory in a blow that ends in handcuffs, nor dignity in a fight that erases your future before it even begins. True strength does not lie in the power of your arms or the size of your anger, but in the courage to take a deep breath, swallow the insult, and walk away from a tragedy that will destroy everything. I also understood that freedom is not just walking down a street without walls, but the ability to recognize yourself in the mirror without a system needing to give you a number. When you surrender your life to the control of others because of an impulsive mistake, you don't just lose the years, you lose your very identity, layer by layer, until only an institutionalized shell remains. The world never waits for the repentant, and time never forgives those who act without thinking about the irreversible consequences. Value the simplicity of deciding what to eat, where to walk, and who to talk to, because those small daily choices are the only real fabric of your humanity. Once you allow the iron of the bars to become your only reference of security, freedom stops being a dream and becomes the most terrifying nightmare of your life. Maybe you are listening to this now and thinking your routine is monotonous or that your life doesn't have the glow you so desired. But look closely at your hands and feel the air entering your lungs freely, without the smell of metal and disinfectant that has haunted me for decades. You still have the sacred power to decide where you will have dinner, who you will hug, and which path you will take when you leave home tomorrow morning. Do not let a moment of wounded pride or a wrong word said in some bar erase the rest of your existence as if you had never passed through here. The mistake that brought me to this cell started with the same blindness you feel when someone offends you without reason. Stop, breathe, and remember. Freedom is thin glass that shatters with a single blow, and the pieces never fit back together. My journey here is coming to an end, but true freedom feels like an ocean too deep for me to swim in right now. The guard is already coming up the corridor, and the metallic sound of the keys hitting his belt is the only metronome my soul still understands. I'm going to keep Sarah's photo in my pocket and wait for the steel gate to open, even if my old legs tremble at the vastness of the blue sky. Don't let blind pride write the script of your life, because the price of silence is an eternity that no one deserves to carry. If you lost everything you know today and woke up 50 years from now, would you have the courage to open the door and try to live in a world that doesn't even remember your name? Leave your answer in the comments, because your reflections are the only breath of life that still reaches this cell.